Blessing never stayed late at work. To her friends and colleagues, she was the quintessential social butterfly, always flitting from one engagement to the next. But tonight was different. She lingered, offered to give a young lady her contraceptive injection, and helped to dress a wound, even though she should have been off duty half an hour before. Her heart thudded softly as she thought about Seb. His tall, refined demeanor and the air of quiet authority he carried had captured her attention from the moment she met him. The news that his wife had returned to England with their children gave her pause. It wasn't just the absence of a spouse, it was a rare window of opportunity. Blessing smiled faintly at her reflection in the glass of the office cabinet. "I can do this," she murmured to herself. Her confidence was her greatest asset, and she had decided that tonight was the night to subtly plant the seeds of a connection with Seb. Seb's office was a reflection of his dual roles, a doctor and an administrator. Stacks of patient files vied for space with ledgers and receipts from the day's payments. The air was thick with the faint smell of antiseptic and worn paper. Seb leaned back in his chair. It had been a grueling day. 3 patients had to be referred to the General Hospital in Igovia. In England, they would have been whisked away by an ambulance, but here, families scrambled to find transport, often pooling resources to hire an old Danfo bus. Seb sighed. His mind wandered to England, where his wife and children were living. He didn't blame her for leaving, but the loneliness was undeniable. A soft knock on the door broke his reverie. Seb glanced up when the door creaked open. He expected to see Mrs. Akabundu or the cashier with the day's takings, but instead, Blessing stood in the doorway. Her uniform was impeccably white, her dark skin glowing under the fluorescent lights. She exuded confidence, yet her posture had a deliberate softness. "Good evening, Dr. Imo," she said, her voice smooth, her accent refined. Seb straightened in his chair, surprised by her polished demeanor. Blessing took a few steps forward and paused, giving him time to register her presence. "I was at Jacinta's wedding a few weeks ago," she said. "We spoke briefly there. I'm one of the nurses here." "Yes, I remember," Seb replied, motioning her to sit. "What brings you here this evening?" She sat down, carefully adjusting her uniform. "I spoke to Mrs. Akabundu about some headaches I've been having. She suggested I see you." Seb listened intently as Blessing described her symptoms. His tone was measured as he asked routine questions, though he couldn't help but notice her careful choice of words and the subtle way she emphasized her admiration for his work. "How old are you?" he asked, noting the sheen of her flawless skin and the energy in her eyes. 26, she replied, a hint of pride in her voice. "I thought you were younger," he said, realizing too late that it might be taken as flirtation. But Blessing smiled, her lashes lowering modestly. "Thank you, sir." After examining her, Seb leaned back. "It's likely a migraine, nothing serious. If it worsens, take some paracetamol, drink plenty of water, and rest. Are you sleeping well?" "It's been difficult," she admitted. "The heat makes it unbearable sometimes. If it persists, come back. My door is open any time," he said, his voice warm but professional. Blessing lingered, her gaze soft. "Thank you, sir. The patients speak so highly of you. They say you've brought hope to this town." Seb chuckled, slightly embarrassed. "I'm just doing my job." As Seb packed up his notes, Blessing stood to leave, but turned back. "Some patients brought fruits for you," she said. "Mrs. Akabundu asked me to bring them to your house. I'll hire a taxi." "That's kind," Seb said. "My houseboy Gideon will be home. You can hand them to him." Blessing hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering with something unspoken. "All right, sir. Thank you." She curtsied slightly, her movement graceful, and left the room. Seb sat for a moment, staring at the door after it closed. Something about her lingered, a warmth, a presence. He shook his head and went back to his work, but the thought of her stayed with him longer than he expected. Outside, Blessing walked down the corridor, her smile spreading wider. Tonight, she had planted a seed. Seb had noticed her, and for now, that was enough.